Hello, fellow photographers. Today we're going to take a little extra time and be talking about possibly one of the most important settings on your camera. This is the aperture setting, or the f-stop. Okay, so what is that? Your aperture is basically a hole in your camera's lens that lets the light pass through it to reach your camera sensor or film. The f-stop is the number that you see on your camera's lens or in your camera that you use to adjust the size of your aperture opening. I've always found that it's best to think of the f-stop as a fraction. An aperture of f2 is much larger than an aperture of f32. This is one of the hardest concepts to grasp early on in photography, but if you think of them as fractions, it tends to make it a whole lot easier to understand. Visually seeing the change also helps. So I have an older lens here with an aperture ring that is controlled by the lens and not by the camera setting. So let's take a look inside and see what it is that I am talking about. So we're going to start with the lens at its most wide open aperture. This is going to be f3.5. This works just like the pupil of your eye. A large aperture lets in a lot of light. If you're shooting at night without a tripod, you may find yourself favoring a larger f-stop to allow it to let in the appropriate amount of light, that and probably a higher ISO as well. So now we're going to stop down the lens to its minimum aperture, and that's going to be f22. A quick side note, if you hear the phrase stopping down, this is what is being implied: to choose a smaller f-stop to achieve the desired effect being mentioned. So as we reach the smallest aperture, you will notice that the hole in my lens has decreased quite a bit, and these settings will affect quite a lot in your photographs. So let's get started and talk about what this setting is and what it will affect. The first and probably one of the two most important byproducts of your aperture size is brightness or exposure of your photo. So as I mentioned earlier, the larger aperture you have, or the more wide open you are, then the more light that will be allowed through your lens to your sensor or film. So if it's a very bright day out, you can lower your ISO, increase your shutter speed, and or stop down to a smaller aperture or f-stop. The type of picture you're trying to take will depict which of these settings you change to achieve the desired outcome. If you're trying to get a dreamy picture at the beach where the waves blend together, then you have to shoot at a slow shutter speed. So stopping down your aperture makes sense in this case, as well as shooting at a low ISO. This is a situation where you may need to use a neutral density filter as well, but we'll get into that in a later video in early February. If you're shooting with a flash and the subject is becoming too bright, but you can't increase the shutter speed due to the seeing speed of the flash, and you can't lower your ISO anymore, then stopping down your aperture will also darken the image and decrease the amount of light that is bouncing off of your subject and returning to your sensor or film. This will also change your depth of field, so you will have to compensate by changing your f-stop due to brightness just to understand that your depth of field will also change as well. If you're trying to get a picture that has a shallow depth of field, then you will want to open up your aperture more and then speed up your shutter speed and or decrease your ISO to achieve the proper exposure. So with this statement, I just hinted that your aperture will control your depth of field. Yes, this is one of the three things that will control it, along with focal length and the distance of your subject to your camera. In 2 weeks, I will post a video where I will go into more detail about what depth of field is and how to achieve it. In portrait photography, you will find yourself using wider apertures more than not. Reason being is you want your subject to be sharp, but you want the background to kind of fade away. But for the sake of keeping this video shorter, I will just say that exposure and depth of field are the two main things that will be controlled by the f-stop you choose. In the beginning, these are the two most important things to remember and practice when you're learning about your aperture. Once you have a decent understanding of those, then we will get into learning what chromatic aberration and lens diffraction are. Chromatic aberration happens when your lens is more wide open. You will notice discoloration around edges of subjects in your image. And diffraction happens when you are stopped down, and you will notice that instead of increasingly getting sharper, that your image will begin to get soft again. This is why it is important to know what your lens's sweet spot is. I have a video that I already posted called How to Find Your Lens's Sweet Spot. In this video, I go into more detail about what causes chromatic aberration and diffraction and how to avoid it by finding your sweet spot. For the sake of mentioning everything that is affected by your f-stop, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the focus shift that occurs on some lenses. This is when you don't change the focus and only change your f-stop, and now your photo appears to be focusing further away or closer than you had it set. There are tests you can do to find out if any of your lenses suffer from this, but honestly, I don't think that it's that big of a deal. Why? Well, because it's best practice to always focus before you take your picture, especially if you change any setting at all. So if you're doing that, then this will never affect you in photography. Dust specks on your camera sensor can also appear more in focus due to the f-stop you choose. In the digital world, since you're no longer rotating through a different spot of film while you are taking pictures, the same element is what's being exposed every time, and you now risk getting dirt or dust on your camera sensor. This can obviously be cleaned, and there are practices that you can do to eliminate your exposure of your camera sensor to the elements. But sadly, this is something that is going to happen. If you know that you have dust on your sensor, but you don't have time to clean it before you shoot, you can minimize its effect by shooting at a wider aperture. The more you stop down, the more the dust will be pronounced. I don't tend to let this affect me when I'm shooting because if I do notice some dust and I haven't been able to clean my sensor, I don't want that to depict the kinds of photos I can capture. For something like this, I would just rely on the post-processing power and the spot healing brush tool in Photoshop to take care of those issues. If you're shooting landscape photography, you're going to prefer smaller apertures because you're going to be able to get both the foreground and the background and the midground all in focus. But this will also make dust on your sensor more in focus as well. I choose to retouch the photo in post-processing rather than losing depth of field. Focusing in low light. This is where the computerized lens of your camera will use its most wide open aperture to focus. Now, if you're using the ring setting on your lens, then your camera will not be able to do this, and you will focus with the amount of light that is coming in with that current setting. Also, if you're shooting with an older, fully manual camera, then this is not something that will be applicable to that scenario either. But most cameras and lenses these days will open the lens to its widest opening so that the computer in your camera can use as much light as possible to do its best to autofocus for you. This is where having a fast lens will come in handy. You can look at the numbers on most lenses these days to find out how wide its aperture will open to, thus how fast the lens is. The term speed in lens goes back to exposure, and wider opening will allow you to have a faster shutter speed. So that's what the term fast lens means. This lens has a maximum aperture of 4.5 as listed right here on the lens. The last two things that we're going to touch on are going to be artistic approaches in photography utilizing the aperture. The first is going to be bouquet. This is the quality of the background highlights that are out of focus. I will post a video on Valentine's Day that focuses just on bouquets, but for now, it is an artistic choice that will let you utilize your chromatic aberrations to achieve a style. You get these by using a wide aperture and having the background lights further away from your subject so that you can have shallow depth of field, only having your subject in focus while the lights become a bouquet. Jumping to the opposite end of the spectrum, you can use bright lights and small f-stop to get a starburst to form. This is where the rays of the light will shoot out from the source of the light. To get really pronounced ones, use a longer shutter speed as well. But you can get these in your landscape picture by stopping down to a small aperture and by shooting into the sun through some trees, or you can get most light sources to produce this at night by shooting with slow shutter speed and a small aperture. How does this work? Well, basically, for every aperture blade in your lens, you will end up with a sunbeam. This only happens if you photograph a small bright point of light, such as the sun when it's partially blocked or a street light. The starburst effect will also look different depending on your lens. It all comes down to your aperture blades. If your lens has 6 aperture blades, you will get 6 light rays. If your lens has 8 aperture blades, you will get 8 light rays. And to throw you for a loop, if your lens has 9 aperture blades, you will get 18 light rays. This is because with odd number of aperture blades, you will get twice as many light rays. That's because when you have an even number of blades, the rays will overlap the others and you will not notice them. But if you have an odd number, then the rays will not overlap and you will see all of the light rays. There was a lot to cover in this video. I hope it was informative to you. Now go out there and put some of this knowledge to the test. Shoot some images with a shallow depth of field or starburst or bouquet, but most of all, have fun shooting.